All the Western classical music periods up until the turn of the 20th century had dominating styles and conventions. Composers tended to stick to these, and a lot of the music composed during that time had a similar sound, but the 20th century saw composers start to escape from these broad traditions of the era, and classical music branched off into lots of different sub-movements. Today we're going to investigate the different strands of the classical music of the 20th century, the composers who contributed to them, and some of their key pieces. We'll take a look at Impressionism, Modernism and Atonalism, electronic music and minimalism, and the influences that jazz and folk had upon classical music, as well as the impacts caused by war and political upheaval. We'll also see that new and exciting classical music continues to be created in the 21st century. The 20th century period of music, as its name suggests, began around 1900. It is the last of the 6 main periods of classical music eras and comes after the Romantic era that ended around 1910. By the end of the Romantic period, classical music had reached something of a turning point, with many conventions and structures having essentially remained in place since the Baroque era of the 17th and 18th centuries. Composers began to reject these traditions in different ways in the 20th century, creating a broad range of totally new and often radical music. As a result, there is no recognizable unified sound to the music of this period, and it is, in general, much more stylistically divergent than the preceding eras of Western art music. As we mentioned earlier, the 20th century isn't made up of one style, but actually several different movements that were popular with different composers, and at different points throughout the 20th century, we'll take a look at some of these movements and the composers that led the way in developing them. So Impressionism was a movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in both art and music, which focused on mood and atmosphere, visual art and audible art. Orchestral works by the French composers Maurice Ravel and Claude Debussy using timbre, ambiguous tonality, and unusual scales to suggest color. It was also intended to be charming and sensuous, in contrast to the heavy, deeply serious music made in the late Romantic period by German composers like Richard Wagner. Debussy's composition La Mer depicts the sea, although he actually rejected the Impressionist label. Impressionist painters like Claude Monet focused on portraying light and movement rather than realistically recreating the minute details of objects. In a sort of parallel to this, Debussy and Ravel rejected the tension and release of traditional cadence-based harmony in favor of tonality that was often more static, remaining with a mode like the whole tone scale, for example, for extended periods. The common practice era, which used a tonal system based on key centers and standard chord progressions, as well as structures like sonata form, had been in place since the Baroque period, and by the 20th century there was a feeling that late Romantic composers like Wagner and Richard Strauss had done everything that could be done within this framework. Lots of music composed in the 20th century did away with these rules, and the modernist movement did so in a particularly extreme way, in keeping with its ethos of rejecting tradition and embracing individuality. One of the key figures of the modernist movement was Arnold Schoenberg, who pioneered atonalism in the 1920s. This rather dissonant-sounding music dispenses with traditional harmonic function and lacks a key center. He also experimented with 12-tone music, which is based on a tone row made up of all 12 notes from the chromatic scale in a given order, with all 12 given more or less equal importance, and then manipulated in various structured ways. His students Alban Berg and Anton Weber developed this approach, which is sometimes referred to as serialism, and the 3 Austrian composers are collectively known for the second Viennese school, with Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven being the first Viennese school. Elsewhere, Russian composer Igor Stravinsky's use of rhythm was highly innovative, utilizing frequent shifting time signatures. This is particularly evident in his revolutionary ballet, The Rite of Spring, which caused quite a stir and a literal riot when it was first performed in 1913. Working in Stalinist Russia, Dmitry Shostakovich was forced to scale back his modernism in favor of a more populist, romantic-inspired style in his symphonic works that was acceptable to the authorities, yet which remained highly creative, while his chamber works display more overtly modernist characteristics. Perhaps partly in response due to the trauma of the First World War, the interwar years saw a return to more ordered art in general, with a focus on structure and emotional restraint. In music, this was manifested in neoclassicism, a movement that took influence from the classical period. Stravinsky's Pulcinella and Sergei Prokofiev's Classical Symphony exemplify this as pieces that put a 20th century twist on the stylings of 17th and 18th century music. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem and Trenody to the Victims of Hiroshima by Krzysztof Eugeniusz Penderecki are examples of pieces that reflect upon the horrors of the Second World War. Jazz, which was created by African Americans, was arguably the biggest musical development of the 20th century. The USA was now a force to be reckoned with in the world of classical composition for the first time, and a number of American composers looked toward the art form for inspiration, including Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and George Gershwin. The latter's Rhapsody in Blue begins with an instantly recognizable clarinet glissando and makes frequent use of the blues scale. Non-American composers also took inspiration from jazz. Frenchman Darius Milhaud's La Création du Monde was inspired by the music he heard in Harlem, New York, while Englishman Malcolm Arnold composed a concerto for swing clarinetist Benny Goodman. Composers also continued to incorporate their native folk music in their work, which was a tradition that began in the Romantic period. Bela Bartók collected Hungarian folk tunes, which provided inspiration for his own work, and Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote an English folk suite. Starting in the 1960s, the minimalist school focused on using minimal musical material and making use of repetitive patterns, loops, and electronic techniques reflecting technological advances of the day. This music was generally more consonant-sounding and less overtly challenging than the modernist school, and composers like Philip Glass and Steve Reich became incredibly popular. By taking recorded sounds of instruments, the human voice or natural environment, for example, composers like Pierre Boulez and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen would manipulate these raw materials and turn them into a sort of musical collages. As the 20th century continued, people came up with various inventive ways of challenging the very meaning of composition. Aleatoric music is music in which some element of the composition is left to chance. Often this means the performer gets to determine how part of the piece should be played, perhaps with a freely improvised section. Henry Cowell's Mosaic Quartet allows the players to play fragments of the music in various different sequences, meaning that one piece can sound different each time it is performed. American composer John Cage used aleatoric elements in music in addition to a pioneering approach to instrumentation. He made use of a prepared piano, which has objects placed on or between the strings to alter its sound, often making it more percussive. Meanwhile, his 433, in which the performers do nothing except be present for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, meaning that this piece is actually composed of the sounds of the atmosphere in the environment, is one of the most famous and controversial works of the modern era. Elsewhere, composers like Charles Ives made use of microtones. These are notes that are similar than the semitones we generally use. We are not used to hearing them, so they sound dissonant and out of tune to our ears, but they usually require instruments to be tuned incredibly precisely. Important classical music continues to be made in the present day in a range of styles. The internet has made music more accessible, making it easier for subgenres to cross-pollinate and influence each other more easily. Music and notation software have also revolutionized the way in which we make music. Film music has become incredibly popular as an art form, and composers like John Williams and Hans Zimmer have helped bring classical-influenced music to a wider audience. Give this a like to help more people learn about classical music history. Subscribe and click the bell to never miss a post, and check out some more about your favorite classical composers linked below.